when you're looking at like that dopamine response, again, that feel good response, things came up for me, and thinking about that in my own usage of nicotine. And I'm like, that makes perfect sense. And I didn't really credit that as much, in that it does mellow you out, makes you feel a little bit downregulated, in a sense. And I got to think about, I was like, God, with all the problems that exist out there with people and their dopamine response, because they've overstimulated it through something, or they're looking for it to be overstimulated through something, behaviors, drugs, and even pharmaceutical drugs like SSRIs, where we're trying to balance out that dopamine response for somebody with a depressive disorder of some kind. Where does this fit in? Now, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know, but that came up for me in kind of reading deeper into this, listening to people talk about it that are, very much on the science end of the whole thing. I was like, wow, there's probably a lot of application here, but something to understand if you're using nicotine, that you have kind of this double response. Combine that with caffeine, and what do we have here? Like, again, you have two very natural substances that come from, the earth, and we can combine those together. And again, caffeine being a highly studied ergogenic aid, right, as well as neurocognitive, there's some neurocognitive benefit there at some level. Put those two things together, and you're kind of like hitting the afterburner button. The interesting part is like, how long does it last again, and like who does it
and can that have a negative side effect? I was going to use a larger word, but can that have a negative side effect over time? Like, if I'm, we've talked about before, like if I'm pushing that caffeine button over and over and over again, eventually I'm not going to get the same response. So I think when it comes to the combination, I thought of that as well when I was looking. I hadn't really looked much into nicotine prior to this conversation, so I was looking into it more. I was thinking this is somewhat similar to caffeine in terms of how this can be utilized, and where that, finding that boundary between where this is a performance or a cognitive enhancer, and when we kind of cross over to the other side of it being potentially harmful. Sounds like a strong word, but yeah, where you can get to the point of diminishing returns. Yeah, so how often you're using it and how much.
You're almost like a crutch or dependency on. Yeah. In order for me to get ready, I have to,
use the stimulant,
ingest these stimulants or these substances. So again, nicotine being an interesting one, where caffeine is more known as a stimulant. Nicotine is both a stimulant in a neurocognitive way from a focus perspective, but the dopamine response creates this sense of relaxation.
You get like a euphoria from nicotine that you don't get from caffeine.
Yep.
In my personal experience.
So when people say it's a high, they get like the high or whatever, it's kind of like a buzz, depending on how, again, you got to keep in mind here, and I won't quit saying this, there's this concept of individuality. So each person is affected differently.
Yeah, that's what I mean, I'm really absorbing a lot of what you guys are saying with this. And my experience with nicotine, I've actually never done things like a pouch or anything like that. It's been in other forms, and I've kind of had honestly like a love-hate with it. I feel things really strongly generally, even with caffeine or other substances. And so it's kind of, I was thinking when we first were talking about how almost being like an upregulator, that it like increased heart rate, things like that. But then it almost, it's had a weird effect, and it might honestly just been the dosage I was taking. It almost made me like a little foggy. It almost makes me feel like kind of sedated too.
Yeah, kind of stuck.
Yeah. So that's where I've like struggled with, like, again, and maybe it's like the dosage or the individuality. And because I tend to feel substances really aggressively, like even like we've talked about some of the different aids. There's even like a focus aid that when I drink those, I feel very wired in a weird way. And so I've never really played with it too, but I wonder like if that's mainly just like the dosage that I've been using and things like that, because it hasn't been an effect where like, oh, I feel really good, I like this, I want more of this. It's been something that's almost turned me off from it.
I'd be curious as far as like the method of how you were ingesting it.
Yeah, that was my question too. Yeah, was this like a hookah or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I've ever done like a hookah, or even like you'll feel a little bit from a cigar. I've ever a vape or something like that. Yeah, but I've never done chew or anything like that, or a pouch. So, but
there's some other things happening.
I wonder if there's also mechanisms with those as well, those forms.
Yeah, probably.
Versus the pouch.
Yeah, probably, again. And I think that has to do, again, concept of individuality and the intensity at which your body reacts to it.
Yeah.
There's some other, so we're talking about sort of sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous systems and kind of what's going on. There's some other downstream things that are happening there too from a cardiovascular perspective. Nicotine is known to be a vasoconstrictor, right? So in general, that's what it's known for. So it actually makes the blood vessels a little smaller. So as that happens, you could get an increased heart rate and blood pressure, right? So that is a very natural response to this type of a substance and kind of what's going on in there. And how does that interplay with, performance? Yeah. And there's been a lot of, study. There's been, I don't want to say a lot. There's been quite a few, and I think there'll be quite a few more in terms of like, how would that impact you on a, like in a human performance perspective and like at athletics or an event from a cardiorespiratory perspective, if you're more of an endurance athlete or, from an anaerobic perspective, if you're more of a weightlifter or, short sprint type of athlete.
I actually came across some articles talking about that as far as the impact of nicotine on athletes, endurance athletes, and then also power athletes, and then rate of perceived exertion for those individuals. And I thought that information was really interesting because the jury's still out as far as the performance aspect. However, the rate of perceived exertion, it seems like the trend is that individuals, I think maybe it has to do more with the dopamine response, but the rate of perceived exertion, they can go longer. I think it was like 12 or 17% more to their time of exhaustion.
Right. So there's I guess, what's the term I'm looking for here? What you're feeling is like their threshold is a little deeper, right? They can go a little longer. And so there's actually, there were some other things in there that I read in some of those papers, those published or in peer-reviewed articles about pain thresholds being a little higher as well, with the use of nicotine. And those were largely done around the gum, by the way. There were some pouches and there was a lot of stuff done with the gum because Stephen mentioned it. We have it in the form of, you can get in the form of vape, tobacco products, smoking them, chewing them. There's snuff and snus. There's the dip, or there's the powdered form that you might be inhaling nasally or whatever, or smoking. And then there's I mentioned the gum. There's lozenges, and then obviously the pouches. So they're all coming with various. And those are different delivery systems, so those play into it here. But there are all these different forms. And again, what are we taking in? We're taking in, like in the pouch, what you've got is nicotine, which is basically made up of like a nicotine salt, right? It's been broken down and it's either been derived in a laboratory or it's been extracted from the tobacco leaf. So that's something to think about too when you're using these products and maybe digging in a little deeper on like, where is this actually coming from, right? Because it's coming directly from the leaf, right? We already mentioned, you're getting, again, if it's being extracted, are you onboarding those other 69, chemicals that come along with it?
And I think that's an important distinction between like your Zyn and your other brands that are out there, I don't know, Skoal, for example, that have been producing nicotine pouches for a long time. Nicotine pouches or tobacco pouches is actually probably a more accurate way to describe what's been around for a long time as an alternative to dip, but then that still contains those other components of tobacco. So it's not like, oh, pouches are pouches, not necessarily. Like the Zyn is going to be a tobacco-free product, whereas your whatever Skoal pouches that have been around forever contain tobacco.